What up, Wizards? It's Dev and the Chicken. We're from the place, and today we got more of that rotation content because you liked it so much the last time, and patrons won't stop voting for it. Cannot get enough of rotation stuff. And today we get to talk about one of the good things about rotation because, you know, I won't be the first person to admit it. I'll be the 10th person in any given room to admit that rotation may have its issues. There are a few bad things about cards rotating out and you can never play with them in standard again. Yeah, it kind of sucks. But one of the better things about rotation is all the cards have been waiting in line patiently for all these other cards to get out of standard so they can actually have a shot for once. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to choose 10 cards that I think are going to get better after rotation.
And I'm your favorite Magic Channel's favorite Magic Channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck tech.
And we're back. Not only are we back, we are big backed. But if you're going to watch a rotation video on YouTube, you probably want to know what rotates in case it slipped your mind. It's both Innistrad sets, Crimson Vow, and Midnight Hunt. They weren't released in that order. Who cares? Also, Kamigawa Neon Dynasty and the Streets of New Capenna are all out of here as soon as Bloomburrow comes in, and that's going to happen in just over 2 months now. And just for the record, why not? All the sets that stay in standard, and there are a lot of them, are Dominaria United, The Brothers War, Phyrexia All Will Be One, March of the Machine, March of the Machine Aftermath, Throne of Eldraine. Is it Throne of Eldraine? Wilds of Eldraine, not Throne of Eldraine rotated years ago. But there's also Lost Caverns of Ixalan, Murders at Karlov Manor, and the one that just came out, Cowboy set, Outlaws at Thunder Junction. I just call it the Cowboy set, so I kind of forgot the name of it for a second there. But yeah, that's still a whole bunch of sets in standard. Also Bloomburrow, I should point out. But even though there's still going to be so many sets in standard for the foreseeable future, there's still a bunch of cards on their way out that are really important in the current meta. First of all, we lose tri-lands and we lose slow lands. That's bad for certain decks, right? Things like Domain, but even like mid-range and control decks, and even really some aggressive decks are going to miss these slow lands leaving especially, and we'll hope that Bloomburrow replaces them with some other acceptable rare level dual land, but maybe they won't, and maybe that'll be fine. We also lose the channel lands, which I've seen a lot of people celebrating, but I actually kind of think it sucks. I love the channel lands, but that's just me. As far as control goes, it loses a number of important pieces to its game plan. Wandering Emperor, Memory Deluge, March of Otherworldly Lights. So that's 2 cards right there that exile things. Also, Leyline Binding is still going to be in standard, but it's not going to have those tri-lands. So that's another white exile piece that you might not be seeing around so often, and I think that's going to have consequences. Apart from that, the Raffine decks lose Raffine, the Slogurk decks lose Slogurk, and the New Capenna land decks lose the New Capenna lands. So that's probably going to shake up standard just a little bit. We also lose Topiary Stomper, Depopulate, Kimana Faces Kakazan, Valdaran Epicure, Wedding Announcement, and like 10 other cards that again are like super important in current standard. So it's going to shake things up a lot. And lucky for you, that's what I like. Shake things up as much as you want to. But with all that setup finally accomplished, let's get to the point of the video. What cards are going to come in, fill those vacuums, replace those cards that are rotating, and in some cases, just take advantage of those cards' absences. There's a lot of them that I want to talk about, but I've narrowed it down to really 13. I've got 10 and then 3 honorable mentions for this one. So let's start with these HMs, and the first 2 are actually addressing the same loss in standard, which I just happen to feel is maybe the most important loss to address in all of standard. I already mentioned the tri-lands and the slow lands. In fact, I mentioned them first when listing all the stuff that rotates. I think that's because they are by far the most impactful of the cards to rotate. And they're going to change the way we build decks in standard kind of dramatically because we lose those cards. So people are going to be looking for fancy ways to make fancy mana. And luckily, I think we got a couple of ways that have been overlooked up to now, but might see a little bit more play in the future. And that's Leyline of the Guild Pact and even Wrenn and Realmbreaker. Both of these just fix your mana entirely, right? Both of them basically just say, like, you make whatever mana you want to, son, just don't bother me. So they seem like pretty powerful pieces in a format where decks still want to play, you know, 3, 4, 5 colors even sometimes. One thing I do think we'll see, especially in the early days of the format right after rotation, is a bunch of aggressive decks taking hold. And that's again because we don't have these kind of mana-fixing lands for slower kind of mid-range or control decks anymore. But again, those decks that do want to take that route definitely have access to a couple of pretty good-looking cards, and it's not like, well, Leyline doesn't do anything but fix your mana, but like Wrenn and Realmbreaker does a bunch of actually kind of really cool stuff. Mills you, and it kind of draws you important cards and stuff. It's a fine card. And it hasn't really seen too much play lately, and I think that's maybe not just because, but in some small part at least, due to the fact that we have such perfect mana in standard. So basically I'm saying if we're forced to play Wrenn and Realmbreaker, we might finally understand that it's a halfway decent Magic card. Now my other honorable mention is much more honorable mention-y, at least to my mind, and it's 3 Blind Mice. Now, Wedding Announcements leave in Standard, and this has the almost sort of looks like it could be a Wedding Announcement's cousin, right? So I think there's at least that to bring up. I think when we no longer have Announcement as an option, this is just going to look much, much better. But there's also the fact that Bloomburrow is going to have mice and Mises, right? So I should at least mention that. I'm going to try to stay away from like Bloomburrow speculation so much in this video because it seems kind of hacky and easy and predictable to be like, well, this is a cute creature type, therefore Bloomburrow. Again, I'm going to try to... That was weird. Light just cut out for a second over here. Odd. Either way, I'm going to try to stay away from that in this video for the most part, but I should at least bring up that this and like Cheeky House Mouse and Raging Battle Mouse, they're all mice, so you can make the Mtg deck, and you'll be happy with that. But mostly, this is going to at least attempt to replace Wedding Announcement, and we'll see whether or not it actually can, but I do think people are going to be playing with the card. Let's get to my number 10. It's Ancient Cornucopia, replacing the Celestis, which is a card plenty of decks still actually play. You'll catch blue-white control, or even like Espers sometimes playing this thing. It's in a ton of different, control decks, and even like ramp decks from time to time, depending on what angle they're taking. It's in a bunch of the like artifact decks that you're seeing, the synthesizer decks right now. So, we need to replace this card. It's been a pretty good card, but that said, I really cannot wait to stop having to care about day-night. I hate day-night as a mechanic so much, and I'm super happy that the whole kit and caboodle is rotating, but especially the Celestis, because I feel like it triggers every freaking turn, whether you expect it to or not. I don't know how they're doing that, but still, Ancient Cornucopia might not be quite the card that the Celestis is, because, I really like drawing cards, but I've already played against a bunch of people playing Cornucopia in like the current season, and they always seem to gain somewhere around 700 life off of this card. So it's pretty impressive. Especially when they get multiple corns in play, then they really start popping off. That counts as a joke. Either way, great card. That's already kind of good, but once Celestis rotates, I actually think this will just be one of the best mana rocks in Standard, and people will take advantage of it. I kind of joked when I first saw this card, like, what are you going to play, Naya Control? Yeah, it's exactly what you're going to do. It turns out it's a pretty good deck. Number 9 is Harbin. Yeah, I imagine we might be seeing a little bit more of this guy again come rotation. I'm not sure how good like 2-color aggro is going to be, but it is worth noting that like every 2-color aggro deck gets its fast land, it gets its pain land, so it's got like 8 different lands that come into play untapped. But the thing about Soldiers is it's still going to have like 12 lands that come into play untapped, plus Cavern of Souls, because it's creature type deck, so that's 16. It loses things. Like, I guess, Thalia, a lot of these decks played Thalia, right? And then, like, they mostly played Brutal Cathar, and they lose that, too. But for the most part, the Soldiers deck does not lose that much. It's still got Valiant Veteran, their Anthem effect, and a bunch of other, like, really, really important, like, soldiery cards. And Harbin still just ends the game. Like, sometimes he comes down on 2 as, like, a 3-power flyer, and that's kind of really good in and of itself, but sometimes he'll come down on turn 5 and just end the game because he exists and has other abilities besides flying. So it turns out I think Harbin might have kind of a renaissance after Standard rotates, because if you're going to play like a thematic like creature typey deck, I actually think Soldiers is sneakily one of the best ones to choose. Number 8 is honestly kind of on the same tip as number 9. I just want to talk about aggro because I think it's going to be really, really good after rotation, and with that in mind, Coppercoat Vanguard, bust out this thing again, dust it off, and try to see what humans you can make work. I mean, this deck also loses like Thalia, Brutal Cathar, and a couple of other things. There's some things in the Innistrad sets that care about humans, but almost none of them are very good. So it doesn't really matter that we lose them in the first place, right? So I do think that Vanguard is another good choice for an aggro deck once rotation comes around. And again, I think aggro is going to be a very viable strategy. Now, for all I know, disclaimer here, Boros is still going to be the best deck in the format. They lose Voldar and Epicure, which sounds like it's not that big of a loss, but it's going to keep them from like Gleeful Demolitioning as easily in the early game. It's going to keep them from a couple of different plays, like turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos as often. Voldar and Epicure was a huge part of that. So again, it will affect that deck, but I still think Boros is in a really, really good position after rotation. That said, you really, again, might want to dust these off and see if you can get a humans deck together, because I think that, again, if we're looking at specific creature types that can take advantage of like Cavern of Souls right now, humans is way up there. Number 7 begins the control corner, and we'll start it with no witnesses here, because it's just kind of obvious. A couple of these, the control ones are obvious, right? Because, yeah, we don't have Depopulate anymore. We can just play no witnesses, which is kind of strictly worse because they're almost always going to have more creatures than you. They almost always definitely get the investigate, whereas Depopulate was a little bit different. This is basically always going to give your opponent a card, and I don't love that, but if you're looking for a 4-mana like clean sweeper in white and you're playing control, you're just going to port the Depopulate slot over to no witnesses and stop asking questions. That was easy. What else you got? Number 6 is Farsight Ritual. Now, there's actually a couple of card draw effects that could replace Memory Deluge, you know? Like, in the Murders at Karlov Manor set, there's one for 5 mana and instant speed that gives you, like, a Thopter and some cards, depending on what your opponent chooses to do with the piles and all that. I think that's a pretty decent card, but if you're sticking with the 4-mana slot for this entry, I think that this is just almost certainly the thing that ends up replacing a Memory Deluge. And it's nowhere near as good as a Memory Deluge, because you can only cast it the one time. But that said, a lot of these like blue-white control decks have a random map token laying around from their Restless Anchorage, or they have a might token laying around from Mirrex, or they have an incubator token laying around from Sunfall. A lot of these just have like a random artifact or other token. So I imagine they could pretty easily bargain this and look at the top, what is it, 8 cards of their library? That's one more than a Memory Deluge that you cast out of your yard. You know, it's okay. Again, you only get to cast it once, but this looks at a pretty huge amount of cards, and honestly, I'm not sure if this is the thing at the end of the day. I think maybe Sultai with like Pillage the Bog as its card selection tool is at least something worth looking into, but at the end of the day, Ritual is a decent card even if you don't bargain it, and I think it's worth looking into. Now, number 5, halfway through the list, midday, it's High Noon. I think that's the second time I've effectively done that joke. It was number 25 in the top 50, and I made the halfway point joke with it too, but I think this is actually like where it belongs on this list, because I don't think it becomes like one of the single most important cards in Standard, but I do think it does an awful lot to stave off the onslaught of the inevitable tide of aggro decks. They're going to come with rotation, you know. Again, Boros looks like it already is the best aggro deck in the format, but it might very well be the best deck in the format come rotation. Mono Red loses pieces, but it hangs on to a great deal of good pieces, so it's probably going to be still kicking around, you know. Aside from that, we've already talked about like mono white soldiers and stuff. So I think as far as aggro goes, yeah, there are tools like temporary lockdown to keep it in place, but for the most part, I think High Noon might be a really good tool for making sure the decks don't double spell on every single turn. Also, it's going to help out against like various combo lists and stuff like that, which could be really important too. High Noon is already a good card that's seeing play, but I do think it gets a little bit better in a format where aggro is the play, right? So if you can get this down on turn 2, yeah, you don't have mana up for a removal spell. Probably going to take a shot in the mouth, but it's also going to keep you from taking an awful lot of damage as the game goes on, and I think that's going to be important enough. Plus, it's a removal spell, so whatever. Just altogether, I think, again, the ability to keep your opponent from double spelling is going to be even more important once we hit rotation, because people are going to be trying to go fast. Number 4 is kind of a weird one. It's Subterranean Schooner. Again, already a good Magic card, but I actually think this subtly replaces Rafine. I know it's really weird, but just like Rafine, this is kind of very difficult to deal with. I think you could argue that it's even harder to kill than a Rafine is, because you can't go for the throat-it, right? So that actually makes an enormous difference. But it's also just a thing that, like, Rafine just cares when you attack with anything, but whenever it attacks, it gives you a little bit of value in the form of possibly drawing cards, possibly making your creatures bigger. It costs less to cast than Rafine, all that. So I think one of the reasons is that like blue-black base decks with like Spyglass Siren and Deep Cavern Bat might get a little bit better, because instead of Esper taking advantage of that turn 3 Rafine, you're going to be Dimir taking advantage of that turn 2 or 3 Subterranean Schooner. You know, again, I think those decks might just port over to the boat. But aside from that, I've already mentioned that this is a difficult to deal with permanent type just in general, right? We lose cards like March of Otherworldly Light. We lose Boseiju as well. So there will be nominally fewer main deck ways of taking out artifacts. So I considered things like Urabrass Forge. I considered, you know, Simulacrum Synthesizer. Definitely. I think that deck will be even better after rotation. But as far as like an artifact that's cheap to play, has a lot of value, is worth playing in a very competitive sort of tournament style deck, you know, I definitely see a world where Subterranean Schooner becomes one of the better things you can do to produce value during your attack step, and kind of a mid-rangey or even aggro deck, and kind of be like a plan against sweepers too, which will be fairly prominent after rotation, I think. So I just think this attacks the post-rotation format on several different axes, and it's going to have a lot of success. Now, we are in the top 3 here, and we're going to start with a bit of a swing, because I'm not even sure that I like 100% agree with this prediction, but one thing I do know for sure is that you got to remember that Venerated Rod Priest exists, and it's a really good Magic card. It loses some things. You know, it loses Tamiyo's Safekeeping and March of Swirling Mist, which is a really important card for the deck. Also loses the Green March if you were playing it. There's some things that you'll lose, but I really don't think you lose enough for it to matter. But the deck does still have like Tyvar's Stand and Skrelv and Snakeskin Veil and like all this stuff. Doesn't it have Shore Up? Isn't that in Dominaria United? I mean, it just still has all these amazing pieces. It loses Slip Out the Back. That could matter, but still, I think the deck has more than enough ways of putting together, you know, a winning sort of tempo strategy, even after rotation, because I think it's going to lose a lot of its biggest predators after rotation, and that's going to skyrocket the deck into popularity. I'm not sure that you can play like the Bant one anymore, but I mean, we just got all the fast lands, so I might be like 100% wrong. Either way, you might have to pick a 2-color combination and play like either Simic or Selesnya, but like both decks look super dangerous going into rotation. So again, the big point here is just remember this card exists. It doesn't go anywhere and it's still disgusting. Number 2 is Uncle Aotsman. Now this is already a played card. It sees at least one of play in like Esper, Dimir, Golgari, a lot of different stuff, right? So it's not a bad card, but this is not a list of cards that are suddenly playable after rotation, have never been playable before. No, it's a list of cards that get better. I think this does. Now, we will have so much fewer exile removal. I've already brought this up in this video, that I think this just has so many fewer natural predators in the next standard, you know? Like, Wandering Emperor was already like the big counter to this, but there was March of Otherworldly Light, and again, Leyline Binding will hopefully see a little bit less play after the Tri-lands are gone. So this just, I feel like, runs such a lower risk of getting exiled in the upcoming standard. And yeah, like Elephant in the Room, Sunfall is still going to be the best sweeper in standard because it already is, and there's going to be no reason to play sweepers apart from Sunfall. You know, you're still going to play like Temporary Lockdown, No More Witnesses, but Big Daddy Sweeper is going to be Sunfall unless they print something better, in which case, holy crap, oh no, that's bad, because Sunfall is so busted already. But Sunfall is still a card, but fact remains that they will have Sunfall, but not March, not Emperor, not maybe Leyline Binding, and not a couple of other cards at Exile too that are leaving standard at the moment. So all I'm saying is it's not a guarantee, but there are far fewer pieces of good interaction against this come rotation. I think it gets even better. And number 1, man, basically the same thing I just said. This is not a list of cards that suddenly are playable for the first time ever when rotation is. There's a list of cards that get better, and this I think some people are still going to push back against because they're not going to agree with my reasoning. But enough dilly-dally, enough dither-dather, let's get to it. Number one is Atraxa. Now, I'm going against myself a little bit here because I've already said I think Aggro is going to be huge for the first few weeks of the format. Remember, I've made that qualifier a couple of times here. I think it's an important one, but still, again, there's not going to be as much support for like 3 and 4 and 5 color decks. So where am I getting Atraxa from? Where am I pulling that from? Well, it's still the absolute best thing to ramp into, arguably, in Magic history. There are legacy decks that either ramp into or reanimate an Atraxa right now. A few of them. It's not just the one. So this is maybe the single best reanimation piece at the very least, and one of the best ramp pieces in the history of the game. So I think that there's going to be kind of 2 schools of thought, really 3, after rotation. And it's kind of the thesis we've been gathering towards. One is aggro, right? Who builds the fastest deck wins. And that's usually true of almost any brand new format after a new set comes out. Fastest deck tends to do very well, while all the other decks are shaping up, figuring out what they need to answer and how they need to get their game plan together, whatever. Fastest deck often wins. I think that especially when rotation happens, the fastest deck wins thing usually draws out for about a month. But eventually, people start learning how to, address the aggro problems in the room. And I think once they do that, blue-white control might be on the menu. It still has plenty of lands, even without, Deserted Beach or whatever. It still has plenty of lands to put a blue-white control deck together and plenty of great cards for that deck, right? But the other school of thought is going to be, how do we get Atraxa into play? And there's really not much we can do about that. I think in just a vacuum, in terms of pure power level, this is the most powerful card in Standard. And 7 mana or not, people are always going to be thinking, what's the best, fastest, most reliable way to get to Atraxa? Put it this way, last thing I want to say, Atraxa is already kind of the most powerful single card in the format, in a format that has like 12 sets, or however many sets we're drowning in right now. This Standard is the biggest it's like ever going to be. It's the biggest it ever has been. And that means that we have as many sets as like Explorer. It's not Pioneer. It's not that many sets, obviously. But again, we have a buttload, scientific term, of sets in Standard right now. And Atraxa still rose all the way to the top of that meta. Won the Pro Tour, right? So again, in a format that has, 4 fewer sets in it, a format that's much more narrow, has far fewer things you can actually do in it, has far fewer powerful cards in it, then Atraxa is even more sort of at the pinnacle of a format that is smaller than the one we have now. So again, I just don't think the Atraxa is going to stop anytime soon, and it's probably going to be coming in different forms. And I fully support that, to be honest. I think that it looks like we're going to be in a kind of paper, rock, scissors dichotomy from what we can tell right now, where fast decks are going to be very, very good, at least again for the first few weeks and probably beyond. And there's going to be a control deck that's trying to figure out how to defeat those fast decks. And in the background, Atraxa. So I don't know if it's paper, rock, scissors, but I do think that is the trichotomy that we're going to be seeing, at least in the very early days, almost no matter what's in Bloomburrow, believe it or not. So I don't know. That's my 2 cents for now. Again, there were other cards I wanted to bring up. I had like 25 written out, but narrowed it down to 10. So if there's any I didn't mention here, I probably wanted to mention them. Just hit me up in the comments section. Let me know all the cards that you hope will get better once we get to rotation. Just let me know all your thoughts down there in the comments, and I will have some more rotation content for you soon. Like I said, it's all anyone's voting for at this point. But if you're interested in affecting those votes, check out the Patreon. It's the only way I really can get paid for what I'm doing around here. I get some AdSense money from time to time, but for the most part, Patreon is what pays the bills, as it were. So I'd really appreciate your support. Even $1 a month helps out a good bit. But, you don't have any scratch right now. That's fine. Liking the video is free. Subbing to the sandwich is free. If you want to share the video on social media, that's complete. All these things are free, but honestly, if you don't want to do any of that, then I guess that's fine too. I'm just glad that you're still here. You made it all the way to the end of the video. That's hella watch time, so I owe you. But anyway, that's all I got for now. Just again, let me know what's up in the comments section. I'm sure I missed a card that's going to be like the best card in Standard, like what's rotation it's. But anyway, that's all I got for this one. That is Allski, Kowalski, as well as Itsky Galitsky. I am Deb from the place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.